The Utah Utes have made a ton of changes to their roster and the coaching staff this offseason, but in my opinion, they could absolutely be a college football playoff contender. I'm going to go over all of the changes that happened over the offseason and then give you an outlook on what this Utah season is going to look like, especially considering the other shakeups here in the Big 12. But let's start with the 2025 year. They went 11-2. And this was one of the most dominant run games that I've ever seen in a Utah Utes team. Kyle Whittingham has been the coach there for 20 years, filling in for Urban Meyer after he departed to Florida, and he's done a phenomenal job with this team. Whittingham won 9 games 12 times in 20 years. That is a feat that you do not see in college football very often. However, the elusive playoffs just continued to miss Utah, and I think it came down to that close loss versus BYU in the Holy War. If they win that game, they are definitely a better consideration for a college football playoff spot, but Utah falls fairly short again. We've seen this kind of time and time again with the Utes. I don't necessarily think that this is a condemnation on the program, just more along the lines of a reality of where Utah sits in the college football landscape. But like I said, unbelievably dominant against everyone else in college football last year, except for their 2 Big 12 rivals right now, Texas Tech and BYU. They were 4th in the country in scoring, 19th in the red zone scoring percentage, 1st in yards per rush. They had one of the best rushing attacks that I've seen in a long time from a power conference team. And then on the defensive end, I don't think that they were nearly as bad as people say that they were. They were a top 25 defense, 16th in scoring, 14th in pass yards per game, 21st in sack percentage. Where they struggled was at the line of scrimmage a little bit. They were 114th in yards per rush. Teams really didn't run the ball as dominantly as you would think based off of that statistic. But that being said, top 25 defense nonetheless. Now we go on to Kyle Whittingham at the end of the season. He steps down. Now, there's a lot of conspiracies about this. He ends up becoming the coach at Michigan, but the heir apparent that has been known for years now at Utah was Morgan Scalley. This guy has been at Utah as well for 20-plus years, both as a player and coach. He was previously the defensive coordinator, now the head coach. He also has to make some changes at the coordinator positions, with offensive coordinator Kevin McGinley coming in from Utah State. Now, Utah State had a really successful offense last year. They were 36th in the country in scoring, which is excellent for a G6 team. And then on the defensive side, Colton Swan, he's been the linebackers coach for a few years. He has a pretty good resume as the linebackers coach. He's got both of the Barton brothers in the NFL, as well as a couple others on active NFL rosters. He steps up to be the defensive coordinator for this Utah team. Now, the roster changes are where it gets significant. Now, let's talk about the players that have transferred out first. A lot of guys went and followed Kyle Whittingham. J.J. Buchanan, who was, I believe, the 3rd best receiving target last year for Utah, 427 yards, 5 touchdowns. On the defensive side, this is where you really see the uptick in losses. Jonah Leale, 23 tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss, starting defensive tackle last year. Smith Snowden, one of the best corners for Utah last year, 24 tackles solo, 9 passes deflected or defended, 2 interceptions. He played actually both ways. We saw him at receiver as well. Teo Johnson, 27 tackles, 4 passes defended, 2 interceptions. John Henry Daly, 24 tackles, 11.5 sacks. He was the best pass rusher for Utah last year. Then moving on to the NFL draft, the offensive line took a massive hit. The 3 interior linemen all had to graduate. Caleb Lomu and Spencer Fano, though, are the absolute biggest headliners of this storyline. Lomu was a 22-game starter. He was a first-team All-Big 12 last year. Fano, on the other hand, 36-game starter for Utah. First-team All-American. This offensive line takes a massive blow. Men looking at the receiving corps, Dallin Bentley, 620 yards, 6 touchdowns, another tight end. I believe he was the 2nd best receiving target. He goes on to the NFL, as well as Lander Barton, who I was really high on as a prospect. I thought he's a really athletic, big linebacker. He's just got to fill in that frame a little bit. Logan Fano, Spencer Fano's brother, also a defensive lineman. 30 tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks last season. These are massive blows to the Utah roster. Now, that being said, let's talk about some returning production before we get into some big factor transfers. Offensively, they've got a good core of players. They've got Devin Dampier, 3,200 total yards and 34 total touchdowns. Dampier, in my opinion, is a top 3 dual threat quarterback in the country. And when I say dual threat, I'm talking about somebody that rushes for over 600 to 700 yards. I believe Dampier last year had 800 yards on the ground and at least 10 touchdowns. I think he had 14 total rushing touchdowns. Really impressive on the ground. And honestly, he doesn't make a lot of mistakes in the air. Only 5 interceptions last year. Now, that being said, he's not a volume passer. I think he'll have to be this year with the offensive line being completely reset, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. But in the backfield with him, Wayshawn Parker, 981 yards and 6 touchdowns last year. He returned. I expect him to have a big year for Utah. Defensively, Jonathan Hall, 43 tackles, 4 passes defended. Elijah Davis, 25 tackles at the corner position, 2 interceptions. And then something a little confusing to me when you look at the depth chart, Jackson Benny, I believe is how you pronounce his name, 43 tackles, 5 passes defended, 4 interceptions, full-time starter last year. Somehow is second on the depth chart at the free safety position. I believe that will change and he'll be the starter, so he's a huge part of the returning production here. Now we look at some of the impact transfers that we expect to have a big role in this Utah team this year. Braden Pagan, I believe he's from Utah State, 926 yards, comes with Kevin McGivern from Utah State, 5 touchdowns last year. I'm sure he'll be utilized as wide receiver 2, maybe wide receiver 1. And then the guy who's also going to be competing with him, Kyrie Scholes, comes from San Jose State, 768 yards last year for the Spartans, 2 touchdowns. We'll see him in a premier role here in Utah. Then the one guy on the offensive line that I want to talk about, Cedric Jefferson, he's going to be taking over that right tackle position. He's probably the most experienced in terms of on-the-field play coming into this new Utah offensive line. He started 16 games last year for Montana State, actually won a national championship. Really impressive. Now, on the defensive end, we've got 2 guys I want to talk about. Ethan Day, coming from North Texas, 7 tackles for loss, big-time run stopper, 23 tackles, a really disruptive guy off the edge, not necessarily a quarterback getter, but definitely somebody who's going to have to fill that role of John Henry Daly. And then in the corner position, Elijah Reed. This is one of the most underrated guys in college football right now. Comes from Akron. I got to see him in a few games last year, and he popped off the tape. He is a lockdown corner, 4 passes defended, 2 interceptions, 30 tackles. I think Utah, who has been known for developing defensive backs, will once again have another guy in Elijah Reed that turns into a star in the Big 12. Now, to me, these are the biggest storylines. Number 1, you're replacing the offensive line. New offensive line coach Jordan Gross is replacing all 5 starters from the number 1 rushing offense last year. Like I said, the scheme will obviously change with Kevin McGivern coming in, but the need to dominate the line of scrimmage has really not been greater over the last few seasons. Yes, they have dominated it over the past couple of years, but the need to do that is so large this season. The second storyline here is, will Dampier take the next step? He loses his offensive coordinator, his head coach, a little bit of stability. His 2 best wide receiving options, or actually his 3 best receiving options, he loses to the NFL and the transfer portal. He's proven over the last couple of years, like I said, that he's one of the best dual threats in the country, but 2 things have to be true to continue to that next step. He has to keep the turnovers down like he did last year, and he has to stay healthy, which he struggled to do. Now, I have a ton of faith that the coaching staff is putting him in a position to succeed and not putting his body on the line nearly as much as they did last year. I think he's ready to take the next step, but that's going to be honestly the biggest point of development for Utah. Now, can Morgan Scalley keep the program stable? That's the third storyline here. Kyle Whittingham, like I said, won 9 games 12 times in 20 years. That's 60% of the time they were winning 9 games. and being a contender in their conferences. There are some really lofty expectations for the first year as a head coach, but they have the star power to contend for a college football playoff spot, in my opinion. Now, the real question is, does the schedule work out for them? In my opinion, let's find out. First, you got Idaho, Arkansas, Utah State to start the season, all three at home. Arkansas is rebuilding their program. Idaho is an FCS school. Utah State is a group of 6 school that actually lost a ton of talent to Utah themselves. So I think all three of these programs are not on the same level as Utah is now, even with all the losses. I start out with 3 straight W's. Now, Iowa State, I believe, has 0 returning starters from last year. They had to honestly scrape together the pieces with their head coach, quarterback, and the rest of this roster leaving to Penn State pretty late on in the year last year. Even though this game is on the road and Iowa State has been known to upset people, I don't think that is going to happen at the start of this season. Utah gets the W there. Returning back to the home field for a game versus Kansas. This is, once again, a game where you play a roster that has lost a ton. Jalen Daniel is gone from Kansas. Lance Leipold, honestly, on the hot seat this year. I think Utah controls the line of scrimmage at home, gets another W. They're starting out 5-0. But first upset alert for the Utes at Colorado. This is a game that I'm putting on upset alert. I don't necessarily think that Utah will lose it. Colorado has a lot of instability, just like Utah does in the transfer portal. Honestly, you never know what you're getting with Colorado. I'm going to lean on the stability of Utah and say this is a W. And by stability, I mean that they have more stability than Colorado. But the next game, this is a team that I truly am high on right now. And with Utah, there's a lot of question marks that I don't have answered yet. With Houston, though, I know what I'm getting. And I think this game, even though it's at home, this is upset alert territory for Utah, and I'm calling an outright loss to Houston here. If they win this game, honestly, I don't know if there's another game on this schedule that they will lose. Next up, we go at Cincinnati. This is yet another rebuilding program that has lost a ton of talent in the transfer portal, not ready to compete for the Big 12. Utah is. Slight upset alert there at Cincinnati, but then you come home to BYU. Similarly to Houston, this is a roster that has a lot of continuity and consistency from last year. I'm putting this game once again as an upset alert, but this is the Holy War. It's at Utah, and Utah barely lost this game last season on the road. They get a little bit of revenge there. I'm going to give them the W. At Arizona, once again, upset alert. This is the last upset alert of the year. Noah Fafita and this Arizona offense is hitting into year 2 with their new coaching staff. I think they'll take a step up here. I expect Utah to out-talent Arizona, but honestly, the scrappiness of a team at home while Utah's on the road keeps these games competitive, and I would not be shocked at all for Arizona to win this game. I'll give the W to Utah right now, but like I said, upset alert. At TCU, this is honestly where I think Sonny Dykes, the head coach at TCU, is probably going to get fired. This TCU team has been up and down despite having a lot of talent comparatively to the Big 12, and they've underperformed so far under Sonny Dykes since that playoff run a few years ago. Utah gets the W there, and then home for West Virginia. This is a West Virginia team that's nowhere near Big 12 contention. Right now, I think the ceiling for Utah, honestly, is 12-0. The 2 toughest matchups that they have versus Houston and BYU are both at home. They can absolutely pick off both of those teams. But quite frankly speaking, the floor is 7-5. I could absolutely see them losing to Houston, BYU, on the road to Arizona, on the road to Colorado, and then something in between at Cincinnati and at TCU. That being said, though, my prediction officially is 11-1. I think this is a solid Utah team with a star-studded backfield with the quarterback and running back. The Big 12 is known for explosive offenses, and I think they'll have one of those yet again this season. The key position here is going to be, can the defense continue to be top 25 while the offense takes another step in the right direction under Devin Dampier and new offensive coordinator Kevin McGivern? All that being said, be sure to like and subscribe. Love doing these college football previews. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.